So hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for the International Trade and Investment Law Society's event, International Trade 2020 Election Platforms and Beyond. My name is Poppy Doolin, and I'm the president of ITILS at American University Washington College of Law. I'm thrilled to introduce this fantastic group of speakers tonight to discuss the presidential candidates' platforms relating to trade and what that means heading into 2021. So we're pleased to welcome first WCL alum, Ms. Stacy Ettinger, who's a partner at K&L Gates. Ms. Ettinger previously served for over 9 years as senior legal and policy advisor to Senator Schumer, and she served for over 15 years as a trade negotiator, legal and policy advisor, and litigator at the U.S. Department of Commerce. We're also pleased to welcome Mr. Clete Willems, a partner at Akin Gump. And prior to joining Akin Gump in 2019, Mr. Willems served in many positions at the White House, including as Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economics and as Deputy Director to the National Economic Council. Prior to that, Mr. Willems served at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative for over 8 years. So finally, we're thrilled that moderating the discussion tonight is Ms. Jean Heilman Grier, Trade Principal at Djaghe LLC. Ms. Grier is an expert with over 30 years of experience in the international trade field. And particularly relevant to tonight's discussion, Ms. Grier previously served as the Senior Procurement Negotiator at USTR. So thank you all again for joining us, speakers, and I'll pass the mic over to you, Ms. Grier, to kick off the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Poppy, and thanks to AUs for inviting me to moderate this panel, which is going to look at the potential trade policy in a second Trump administration or under a Biden presidency. I'm going to start by just sort of setting the stage of where we are on trade. As he promised in his inaugural address in 2017, President Trump has pursued an America First agenda. That has translated on the trade front to a liberal use of tariffs under a variety of rarely used laws. They included steel and aluminum tariffs imposed on the national security grounds on virtually all trading partners, whether friend or foe. It includes Section 301 tariffs on China and safeguard tariffs. Trading partners have responded with their own retaliatory tariffs. With regard to trade negotiations, on his third day in office, President Trump took what may be the most consequential action on his trade actions, and he withdrew the US from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, in favor of bilateral trade agreements. However, to date, he has only negotiated one comprehensive agreement. That was the revision of NAFTA. And he's negotiated limited agreements with China, Japan, and just yesterday, Brazil, as well as a modest revision of the Korea FTA. FTA negotiations with Britain and Kenya are now underway. The Trump administration has reinstituted the use of Section 301 of the 1974 trade law against China and most recently Vietnam, actions reminiscent of the use of Section 301 in the late 1980s and 1990s. While there's broad support for the administration's pursuit of China's unfair trade practices in his use of his Section 301 investigation, the administration has largely taken a go-it-alone approach on trying to address China trade issues. The Trump administration has undercut the WTO and brought its dispute settlement mechanism to a standstill amid threats to withdraw from the organization. The question is, would a second Trump term be more of the same, or would we see a greater outreach to US allies to address and resolve some of the systemic issues? For his part, former Vice President Biden appears to share the president's aim of using trade policy to protect US industries and US workers, regarding trade laws as critical tools. But he appears to intend to defer an active trade agenda until he addresses domestic issues after the first year or so, which would be like President Obama at the beginning of his term in 2009. Biden has not sort of spelled out or weighed in on many of the specific issues in the trade arena and may share many of the president's aims, if not his approach. At a minimum, he would be expected to forge a different style than the president, one that was perhaps less confrontational and unpredictable, and that does not regard trade as a zero-sum game. Biden and Trump appear particularly in agreement on Buy America, from Biden's rhetoric, he might even be more aggressive. The president has issued a number of Buy American executive orders, but some question whether or not that has actually achieved very much. So the overarching question with regard to a President Biden term would be, would he restore order to the unpredictable and disruptive US trade policy under President Trump, or where would he take trade policy? So with that opening, I'm going to turn to Clete and let him make an opening statement, and then we'll turn to Stacy.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jean, and thank you to everyone for tuning in today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sure some of you are actually asking yourself, why am I even here? Trump is way behind in the polls. There's no way he's going to win this thing. Why are we even talking about the Trump second term? And I would just say, I think we all need to be careful about our bold, confident predictions. And in fact, the last time I spoke at American University in 2016, I confidently predicted that TPP was not a matter of if, but when. And that, after the election, things would suddenly fall into place for us and we would be back in TPP. And obviously, you see how that worked out, at least so far. And I think, look, with respect to the election, I won't get into that other than to say, I do think we are headed towards a close election. And, two facts that I've been looking at are, if you look at the polls in the swing states today, they're actually closer than they were 4 years ago at this time. The president is behind less than he was 4 years ago. And if you actually look at some of the new voter registrations in the swing states, it's pretty much equal parts Democrats and Republicans, which suggests there's a lot of enthusiasm on both sides. So I just don't want us to get ahead of ourselves. Maybe I can still add value to the discussion. The second thing I think is important in either context is the amount of continuity that I think you're going to see in US trade policy. In many ways, President Trump has stolen the Democrats' mojo on a lot of these trade issues. And I give my Democratic friends a lot of credit. I mean, they were the first to really want us to focus on China. I know something Stacy worked on for years with Senator Schumer, really trying to elevate that issue. They were some of the first really raising these concerns about the WTO and problems with the dispute settlement system. And I do like to remind people that it was actually under Obama that USTR first started blocking the appointment of appellate body members. So, all of this stuff, and you see what Biden has said so far, and it's been a lot about China and Buy America, to the extent that Peter Navarro actually criticized the Biden campaign of plagiarism, called them plagiarists for stealing his ideas. So again, like I said, hopefully I can still add some value. So what is President Trump going to do if he's reelected? The thing about the president that I think makes him somewhat unique among recent presidents is he basically did exactly what he said he was going to do during the campaign. And I like to point back to a speech he gave in June 2016 in Pittsburgh, where he outlined the 7 things he wanted to do on trade. Get tough on China, renegotiate NAFTA, pull out of TPP, use novel trade tools like 232 and 301 and 201 and a couple others. And basically he's done all of that. So I think what the point is he's already doing what he set out to do on trade. And there isn't some grand strategy that's going to unveil itself in the second term. It's largely going to be a continuation of what has been done with some different focuses and some enhancements in different areas. So I think what's most useful is to look at what the president's priorities were, to think about what he's achieved, and then to think about what some of the unfinished business might be. So a couple areas. Number one, China. This clearly, I think, is the hallmark of the president's trade policy. And like I said, I think the Democrats were there in some ways first on this issue, but no one has really taken it on and willing to take the bold action that this president has. And I think he has completely changed the conversation on China, completely changed the political dynamic on China in the United States. And I think in a second term, you're going to see more efforts both to open up China's market when it comes to certain areas. I do think the U.S. does feel like it didn't get all that it wanted out of the phase 1 deal. And a lot of people, including myself, are skeptical about phase 2. But if you have a scenario where the Chinese know that they have to deal with President Trump for 4 more years, that might induce them back to to the negotiating table in a way that they're not willing to do today. I think you will also see a continuation of some of the agenda that looks at moving supply chains out of China that for pharmaceuticals, for technology products, and induces companies to bring jobs back from China. I think that will be a focus for the president. The second thing is efforts at creating a new paradigm for U.S. trade agreements. And I do think, people can nitpick USMCA one way or another. Depending on where you sit, there were some important improvements, or there were some areas where we lost some of the things that were good about NAFTA. But I think what's apparent is that we had one of the more bipartisan votes for that agreement in recent years. And really, I think a bipartisan agenda formed where a lot of the Democratic priorities when it came to autos, rules of origin, or labor and environment were introduced into the equation. And I think that the president's going to want to move forward with additional FTAs. UK is obviously high on the list, and Kenya. And I think you're going to see, again, efforts to address some of those issues that really hadn't been focused on by past administrations. The third is clearly the use of novel tools for leverage. 301, I think, is here to stay. And I think that they will want to further pursue digital services tax by using the 301 mechanism. And I think the currency issue is something that's going to become much more prominent in the second term. And one of the reasons for that is that if you talk to folks in the Trump administration about the trade deficit, which was one of the president's objectives to reduce the trade deficit, that clearly didn't happen to the extent that the president had hoped. But what folks will say is one of the reasons that didn't happen is because one of the real underlying factors on the trade deficit is currency. That you can only do so much through traditional trade policy. And if you really want to change from a systemic standpoint the trade deficit, you need to bring that into the equation. And so I think you're going to see much more of an emphasis on currency issues in the second term. And then I think you're going to see a continued use of 301 and 232, if not from the administration, from petitioners who know that this administration may look at those things more favorably than others did, and may offer more petitions on 232 and 201 and other areas. I mentioned already sort of the efforts at relocating supply chains. I think that's a conversation that will be had. I think there's an open question right now about what tools you use to do that. I think there's an open question about whether it's simply reducing our reliance on China from a broad standpoint and bringing those supply chains home, or actually trying to partner with allies and build up allied supply chains. And I hope that what the Trump administration would do is do more of the latter, and focus on working with allies. But in any event, there is going to be an interest in reducing some of the reliance on China. I think at the WTO, there will be more serious efforts at reform. I do think one of the underrated elements of the Trump administration is that they've been more active than any administration in history when it comes to reform ideas for the negotiating function. And they have put a lot of ideas on the table there. They've put a lot of ideas on the table with respect to monitoring and implementation. A lot of the attention is focused on the dispute settlement side. I think too much attention, quite frankly. It's a problem. It needs to be fixed. I think many of us who practice trade would like to have a functioning appellate body that fulfills its mandate in more of a narrow fashion than previously. But I mean, that has been, I think, consumed a lot of the conversation. I think there hasn't been as much focus on what's been happening on the negotiating side. I think they will continue those efforts in a second term. And so hopefully that's a helpful, I think, overall summary. One last comment I want to make, before Stacy jumps in with the vice president's ideas, Gene, I take your point. I think some of the language that this administration uses with its allies, I think there's been some unforced errors. I personally was opposed to the 232s on Europe. I think that was a mistake. I think that did hurt our relationship. But this notion that the Trump administration, doesn't try to work with allies, I think is somewhat off base. I can tell you when I was in the NEC and the NSC, that was basically all I did every day was try to work with G7 and G20 partners on China issues. And it's very easy to say you're going to do that. It's a lot harder to get it done, because at the end of the day, in order to be effective, you need to convince the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans and everyone else to do the kinds of things we're doing on China, put in place tariffs, impose leverage. And they haven't been that inclined to want to do that. And so, again, I like that Biden is saying that. It's the right message, but it's much easier said than done. And I think the Trump administration has tried more on that front than they get credit for. And I think they're actually making headway when it comes to technology. And you look at the partnerships with India and Australia and Japan and working together on Chinese technology issues. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that gives you some food for thought and helps tee up the questions later on.
Stacy.
Great. Thanks, Clete. Clete and I will probably get into a little bit of a back and forth when we get to the questions, but let me just focus on kind of an overview of where I see, if there's a Biden administration, the sort of big picture items and the focus. Clete did mention some of them, and I agree. I think that big picture, is sort of down in the weeds trade issues going to be the immediate priority. I think in some cases it will be, but I do think overarching there is going to be a focus on getting the country back on its feet, obviously dealing with COVID. And so there'll be a very broad economic policy agenda that will be focused on and geared towards revitalizing American manufacturing and creating jobs, a real focus on the American middle class, a focus on unions that'll be different in a Biden administration, and the idea to try and, again, raise wages and create jobs. I mean, I think this would have been the case even without the pandemic, but with the pandemic, it's that much more urgent. And there are some specific proposals put forward by the Biden campaign for, call them recovery or stimulus proposals, but, spending, planning on spending over $700 billion investing in Buy American related programs, as well as U.S. Technology and innovation programs. That would include also a focus on sort of green technology, electric vehicle technology, and things like that. So that's kind of the bigger picture economic policy agenda. Clete mentioned, and I agree, that there'll be a continuation of support for Buy American when it comes to U.S. government procurement and investment provisions, and a real focus on, pro-American workers, bringing back critical supply chains, and attempting to reduce our dependence on China. And of course, that is, easier said than done. But again, I do think that will, there'll be definitely some similarities there. On the outreach to allies and trading partners to rebuild relationships, I take Clete at his word that he worked very hard with our trading partners. But I do think that this administration, in particular the president, has damaged a lot of our relationships, and it will take a concerted effort to rebuild that trust on an international level. I think that the relationships down sort of at the staff level are probably fine, but on the public stage, I think there's a lot of damage that's been done, and there's a lack of trust, again, at the 30,000 foot level. And it's not just leadership in countries, but it's their citizenry as well, in the sense that, no one likes to see their elected official humiliated on a global stage. And I think that there were many sort of unfortunate incidents, is a diplomatic way of putting it. And so there is a lot of ground to rebuild there. And so I think there will be a focus on rebuilding those relationships and sort of rehabilitating the U.S. On the global stage. The goal will be to work with our allies and trading partners to pressure China, which is going to remain an issue. But also in the context of potential negotiations, will the Biden administration want to consider getting the United States back into TPP? it would require some renegotiation, but I think it will probably be on the table. The question is, not right away. I do think that it'll be a while before that's something that the administration will tackle. The other things that a Biden administration will have to deal with are what I call these legacy tariff issues. And whether it's the 301 China tariffs or the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, we have tariffs related to the WTO, Boeing and Airbus disputes. We have the investigations on digital services taxes, the Vietnam currency issue, which Clete mentioned. I think the issue there is that, it is hard to get rid of things once they're in place, because from a political perspective, you risk looking like you are turning back the clock on something that has been argued has been successful. On the other hand, my experience working in private practice with many small and medium-sized companies who have really been slammed with these tariffs, and it has been, I liken it to being a MASH surgeon and doing triage, right? Try and save the arm, save the leg, save the company. But it's been very difficult and many companies are struggling. I think, focus on confronting foreign efforts to steal American IP. Again, I think that's been a focus for the Trump administration, and will continue to be a focus in the Biden administration. The other sort of legacy issues are there's a series of executive orders, right? And what is in a Biden administration, what are we going to do about those legacy executive orders? Everything from orders on rare earths to WeChat and TikTok to concerns about the cybersecurity in the US telecom sector, the bulk power sector. So those are, something that will have to be addressed. And last but not least, this sort of other national security type issues related to export controls and the CFIUS, the foreign investment issues. The administration has taken a very hard line on China related investment in US technology, and also concerns related to Chinese, say, semiconductors being used in various systems that are tied into, say, the US telecom grid or the bulk power grid. So I think those things will continue, and it'll be interesting to see, and I don't necessarily have a prediction on how the administration's a new Biden administration would handle those, but it's something that they're going to have to think through and address. But but circling back to the beginning, I do think the priority will be, before delving into these, down in the weeds, will be the overall economic policy agenda and trying to help the US and help Americans get back on their feet after dealing with the pandemic, or while we're dealing with the pandemic. And I will stop there.
Okay, thanks to both of you. Let's go back and talk a little bit more about China. Biden has criticized the president's handling of China, and I think Stacy's touched on some of the issues. But I guess the question is going to be, how would he handle, and this is first for Stacy, how would a President Biden handle trade relations with China? And what would be the timing for the engagement? If he's putting, domestic issues first, would he wait for a while before he actually tackles the China issues? Can he afford to wait? What would he do about a phase 2 agreement? And maybe more particularly, what would he do about enforcing the purchasing commitments that China's made under phase 1? So that would be the first questions for Stacy. And then on China, I think with regard to Clete, where is the president going to take this? You said you're kind of skeptical about a phase 2. But the question is, how is he going to address, or will he address, the subsidies issues, the SOE issues? Can he work with could he construct some sort of a mechanism to work with the Europeans, as I think you've suggested elsewhere, as a possibility? So, and then also there's a whole question of that, as Stacy mentioned, the export controls that and then China's response in that with a recent order of sort of responding on the export control issue as well. So I'll let you two sort of take up that issue next. Stacy, do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Jean. Look, I mean, you can't ignore it. I mean, let's be serious. So, from day one, it's going to be an issue. And I think, no politician wants to be seen as backing off or weak on China. I mean, as we head into this election, certainly the, Democrats and Republicans alike are talking tough on China. China's the boogeyman. It's, somewhat akin to how politicians viewed Japan in the 1980s, except that China is a much larger threat just by dint of its size and its economy. I do think that they will want to engage with China. I don't think that they're going to rush into rolling anything back, out of the gate. I'm not so sure that there will be a phase two. I'm not so sure Clete will talk about this, there ever was an intention to have a phase two. In terms of enforcing the, purchase commitments, it seems reasonable to continue to pressure China to live up to promises that it has made. The sort of phase one agreement on its face is, a mixed bag of some substance that's new and some things that China was already moving towards doing on its own that the administration basically wanted to take credit for achieving. There's no reason to back off on at least the commitments that China has made, including, again, whether it's substantive or the purchase agreements. I'm not so sure. I don't think a Biden administration is going to be interested in sort of a one-on-one negotiation with China. I do think the focus will be on the multilateral level and to try and address a number of the problems that the United States and other countries have with China's economic system and their failure to abide by, both in reality and in spirit, the obligations in the WTO. So I do think that the focus longer term will be on a multilateral approach to deal with China.
And I'll jump in here. And Jean, I think you initially asked about, how will a second-term President Trump try to address subsidies and SOEs, and asked about possible phase two. Look, I think it's important to take a step back and think about what actually happened in the trade negotiations. And I was one of the negotiators with China on what became the phase one deal. And basically, the intention from the beginning was to try to have all of these things as part of the package. And I will say, and it's in some ways painful to say it, we actually, in addition to the stuff that actually ended up in phase one, we had been making progress on these other issues with China. Obviously, there's a question of whether they follow through on it and all of that stuff. But at the negotiating table, they were being somewhat forward-leaning. Now, all of that eventually fell apart. And the reason we ended up with phase one is what I like to call it the art of the possible. I mean, at some point, it was no longer politically acceptable for China, once we started taking action on Huawei and everything else, to do all the stuff they wanted to do, that we wanted them to do initially. And so we just got done what we were able to get done. I would take a little bit exception to what Stacy said in terms of it was all stuff that China wanted to do anyway. I mean, there's some truth to that we helped lock in some of the reforms that they were considering. But in some areas, like in the IP chapter and what we got in there on trade secrets, as well as the broad range of agricultural market access issues, that was stuff we really had to fight for, and that wasn't part of their broader plan. So in a second term, does a phase two agreement become relevant again? Look, I think the intention has always been there to do it if possible, but that if possible was a big question. And what I'm speculating on, and it's pure speculation at this point because we don't know, is if the dynamic is where it is today, I would say there's not going to be a phase two. However, if China wakes up like the rest of us on November 4th, and they've got 4 more years of President Trump, 4 more years of $370 billion in tariffs, and all this other stuff going on, they may view the world a slightly different way. And so I don't think it's an impossibility that it could be resurrected in that scenario. I do think, though, in order to optimize their chances for success, a Trump administration or even a Biden administration needs an all of the above approach. You need to try to do stuff bilaterally, but then you also need to work, trilaterally. We're working with the with EU and Japan and getting some of these disciplines on subsidies and SOE. You need to work plurilaterally. Again, I don't want to get into the TPP now, but I think looking at ideas like that to try to constrain China are good. And ultimately, you need to look multilaterally as well. So I think it's an all of the above approach would serve Biden and Trump well for the next 4 years. I will just note, at the WTO level, again, there are legitimate critiques about some of the president's language and the threats and everything else. But the U.S. is at the WTO right now making proposals that would deal with some of the issues with China in terms of the question of China's status as a developing country, in terms of whether or not economies that are part of the WTO need to clarify that they're going to operate on market principles. So there's already attempts there. And again, is it enough? No, we should do more. I hope that whoever wins does more in that fora. But again, it has to be an all of the above approach for either of these guys to actually get it done.
You mentioned, look reform in the S&D issue and developing country status. There's so many of these issues. The U.S., the Biden administration or the Trump administration seems to be wanting to go alone, and they're obviously working with Japan and EU, as you mentioned, trilaterally on some of these issues. And this is sort of a broader question on the whole WTO reform issue, which I think there's a broad consensus developing that there's a need for WTO reform, and certainly the U.S.'s treatment of this appellate body and sort of bringing the appellate body to a stalemate and to halting the whole dispute settlement mechanism. And so the question really is, what can we expect in terms of sort of a proactive, positive agenda that leads to WTO reform and addresses some of these issues? And this is both, I think, a question for what the Trump administration would do, and would it be doing more things, more cooperatively or collegially with other countries? And then for Stacy, how would a Biden administration approach these issues? Would a Biden administration start reappointing or agreeing to reappoint appellate body members, or would it be trying to work out a new mechanism?
So thank you for the question, Gene, and you give me the perfect opportunity to pitch the paper that I actually wrote and released last week through the Atlantic Council, which was really intended to be at least a starting point on how the US and the EU can get on the same page on WTO reform and working with China. And there's tons of ideas in there, but I think the point I'd make is, this notion of go it alone. I think the problem with the US strategy right now might be one of patience. And, the issue for the US has been that we've wanted to work with others, but they haven't initially committed to the kinds of things we thought were necessary. And so then the question comes back to the administration, are we going to sit there and allow our companies to be harmed without taking action? Or are we going to wait, have that harm continue, and hopefully the EU and Japan and everyone else eventually comes along? Now, there's probably a middle approach, right, where you can sort of coordinate it a little better. We're okay, we can be the bad guys. We can take that action, but let's sort of work it through with you. And sort of a hybrid, I think, of what we've done to date. I think, again, I understood and when I was in the government, even on steel, we went to the president and we said, why don't we think about working through this multilaterally, like the Steel Forum? And he said, how long has that been going on and what have you achieved? The answer was a long time and nothing. And so you need to have complementary approaches. And I think that's where this administration can do better at the WTO. I think this administration was right to take the tough action to change the equation, but we could have perhaps coordinated that a little bit better with our allies and then had them do complementary things to the extent that they were willing to show that level of ambition. So again, it's a tough question. I will say, I do think at the WTO, I mean, again, let's talk about the developing country issue for 1 second. I mean, it's just not politically possible anymore for us to say China should be treated preferentially vis-a-vis the US. I mean, it's just never going to ride. You need to fix that issue. And so I think these conversations are hard. Others don't want to change. We need to try to work through the WTO if we can, but I think we need to be creative in saying, if we can't get multilateral agreements in the short term, let's do other things to help change the dynamic of the WTO, so that might be possible at a later date.
Stacy, do you want to pick it up?
Sorry, somebody did background noise. You know, I think one of the interesting things when we talk about WTO reform and moving forward, you know, again, whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden administration, we're going to have a new WTO Director General. And I think it's a good place to sort of, you know, refresh and restart, regardless of which candidate gets the job. You know, I think it provides an opportunity to try and, you know, refocus the WTO member countries to consider the issues that have been raised by the Trump administration, which are, you know, I don't take issue with any of the things that Trump administration has raised in the WTO in terms of concerns about China's subsidy practices, or even, you know, the problems with the appellate body. I mean, I'm on board with those. So I think at this point, I think the Trump administration has set the table on those issues, and I think that's great. And so going forward, how do we then pull together support amongst a range of WTO members to try and address these issues, potentially by reinvigorating sort of the negotiating function of the WTO. And I think, you know, I think the US will want to prioritize that, reinvigorating the negotiating function, before you know, jumping back in on the appellate body issue. I think it provides leverage. And you know, I don't know whether this is how the Biden administration would treat it, but I certainly would be advising them to, you know, hold off on that, because you're somewhat creating leverage, and you know, many members are not happy about it. But I will say, look, some of them have already banded together to figure out their own sort of dispute settlement parallel mechanism. And so I don't think that the first priority should be to try and address the substantive issues. And again, if we can use the sort of appellate body issue as leverage, I think a Biden administration would be wise to continue to do that. Jean, you're on mute.
Whoops. Okay. Thank you. Let's go back and talk about the TPP, or the new CPTPP. And I think the question is, and I think there's a lot of interest in, would a Biden administration rejoin the CPTPP? You know, since it came out of the Obama administration and was intended to provide a forum for the development of trading rules that didn't include China, as opposed to China setting the trading rules. I mean, how likely is it that a Biden administration would see that as a priority and be willing to re-enter it? And I think for Clete, on the same point, is it possible for the Trump administration in a second term to find a way back in? And if so, what would they be looking to change, which I assume they'd have to do some changes in order to justify re-engagement? Stacy, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Jean. I mean, look, a lot of hard work, blood, sweat, and tears went into negotiating TPP through successive administrations. I think at the 30,000 foot level, I don't think this is going to be an out of the gate priority for the Biden administration. Again, the focus will be on dealing with you know, jobs in the U.S. economy is a number one priority. That said, I do think that there will be interest at some point eventually at considering whether the United States could join or re-engage, but it will be, there will be demands. I mean, the US will want to renegotiate or address issues that were, because some things were dropped or changed, obviously, when the United States dropped out. So I think that it is entirely possible the Biden administration will want to engage, but it will be a little bit down the road, and there will be a desire to put the U.S. stamp on it again in order for the U.S. to consider joining.
So in answering this question, I'm going to be very careful to distinguish what I want to happen and what I think will happen. I mean, first, I've been very clear on many times. I mean, I do think that it would be in the U.S. interest to try to re-engage in something like the TPP. And in my opinion, the president had problems with NAFTA. So what did he do? He renegotiated it. And I really think that that would be in the president's best interest to find a way to renegotiate TPP to make it work so that we would benefit from market access with all those countries, but equally important, as we talked about time and again, that we've been able to use it as a tool to encircle China and make progress on that issue. So I would like to see that. Do I think it will happen? I think that's tough. I mean, it has sort of taken on a political life with the president at this point, that I think makes it challenging. But let me put that aside for a second. I mean, politics, we can talk about that all week. Let me focus on substance. The thing that I would say above all else that is unacceptable in the current TPP are the rules of origin for autos. And, when we discussed this in the Trump administration, it was clear that the TPP autos rules of origin were incompatible with the president's vision and incompatible for what he tried to do with USMCA. And look, I don't blame the negotiators. They were my friends while I was at USTR. It's really hard. Japan has a significant interest there. But the autos rules of origin as exist today in the TPP are going to remain unacceptable to the Trump administration. And I actually think they'd probably be unacceptable to the Biden administration as well, given the strong support that we had for USMCA. So that's the thing that unambiguously they would need to try to find a way to change or drop. And one of my former colleagues and great friends, Wendy Cutler, has put forward some ideas on TPP. And her idea is basically, look, start small, figure out what are the parts of the agreement that aren't controversial, start to try to build on that instead of trying to start big and say, let's rejoin the TPP. I think it's more, we've got a set of allies in the region who have adopted some high standards. What are the ones that we can be a part of and build upon rather than saying, let's do the whole darn thing, because I think that's going to be hard to do in any scenario, quite frankly, any administration.
Okay, turning to trade negotiations. I think, as we've mentioned, that both the U.S. is now engaged with both Britain and Kenya on FTA negotiations. And so there's sort of two questions of, can these be finished? First, let's assume the president loses. Can he finish these negotiations, particularly with Britain, before his term of office is over? And if not, would a Biden administration continue those negotiations? And then tied into this is the question of TPA, the Trade Promotion Authority. And any agreement would have to be completed by the end of April in order to finish to meet the requirements for TPA that expires in July 1. And would either a new term for President Trump or a Biden presidency, would that involve, or how would they approach the renewal of TPA? Clete, do you want to start?
Sure, I can go first. I mean, first, let me just say, in a scenario where the president does not win re-election, we're not going to get the UK done by then. I think it's just, I hear from the negotiators it's going quite well and that they're making progress. But look, they've got a lot going on over there. Comprehensive negotiations are also hard. If you haven't noticed, I think you've done them. But it's just not a realistic time frame. I do think they could get it done. If Trump wins, they could get it done by the April TPA deadline. I do think that's realistic. And I'll just say, I hope that Biden will pick it up in any event. I do think it is an important relationship that we need to continue to work on and figure out whether, the UK can move in our direction on some of these key regulatory issues that have been a barrier to Europe. One word on TPA, I think it's going to be a knockdown, drag out fight whenever it happens. I think that there's a lot of frustration in Congress, in terms of some of the trade tools that this administration has used. I think on the other hand, there's a lot of frustration in this administration with some of the restrictions that are imposed upon it by TPA. And so I think both sides will want to see some changes. And it's hard for me to know how that plays out. I suspect, however, that you're going to get a lapse. And then at some point after that, they'll figure out what do they want it to look like moving forward.
Stacy?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, the negotiations are underway. I agree with Clete. I think the UK negotiations are pretty far along, but I don't see it getting done before the end of the year. And so, I think the negotiations will continue into the next administration, whether that's Trump or Biden. And I think TPA renewal will be difficult. I don't know whether the UK could possibly, talks could be wrapped up before, like you said, Jean, that have to be done by April in order to get it through. I don't know whether that's possible because, there's too many issues in play with respect to the UK at this point. And I don't really think that until we know what the Brexit looks like, and what the sort of details are, I don't think that the UK and the US can really ink a deal in any case. Like, I just don't think the timing works out. But that said, I do think the US will continue those talks into the whoever is president in the next administration. I think TPA will probably expire without being renewed by that deadline. Look, the talks can continue with respect to the UK and Kenya and any other talks that are launched. I mean, obviously, you only need the TPA and to be in place when you ink the deal. If you jump through all the hoops that at least that currently exist with respect to TPA. But I don't see any rush to do it again. Back to that 30,000 foot perspective, where the focus for a Biden administration is really going to be on the U.S. economy and U.S. jobs.
Let's talk for a minute about Japan. In January, the U.S. and Japan implemented 2 agreements, one on digital trade and one on tariffs and agricultural trade. And that was set up as a phase 1. And the U.S. had put out published negotiating objectives that made it look like an FTA. They're getting pushback now in Geneva about the second phase. And the question is whether the first phase arguably does not meet the substantially all trade requirements for preferential agreements. So the question is, how is the administration, the Trump administration going to handle this going forward? And what would a Biden administration do? Would they push for a second set of negotiations with Japan? Does the fact that Japan has a new prime minister, does that make a difference?
So I will say that with respect to Japan, it would be great to do a phase 2 deal. And the US as an initial matter had wanted to make phase 1 as comprehensive as possible. And Japan had some concern with that because they really wanted us to go back to TPP. And so we did have some trouble finding a method to negotiate with them on the things we really cared about without them, basically giving up on TPP. So I don't know how they're going to manage that. I think in many respects, it comes down to what Japan's willing to do. Would the US go for a phase 2? Absolutely. We'd love to. We wanted to from day one. But they've always been resistant on that, and maybe the pressure in Geneva will change their opinion, maybe it won't. I don't think it really changes the US perspective. We've always wanted it and we still do. I would say though, that I think you got to note, one of the really big political imperatives for the United States on this was agricultural market access and the fact that our farmers were losing out. And by inking a phase one that included that, there's less of an incentive for the US at this point. So again, we love it, but it's not, high on the priority list because number one, Japan has always been resistant. And number two, we got a lot of what we really needed to get. It would be great to do more. But again, I don't see it super high on the list. It's sort of in the middle.
So just to follow up for a second on that point. So if they don't get to a phase two, how does the US and Japan, how do they justify the preferential treatment in terms under the WTO rules?
I think they've basically been arguing that there's ongoing negotiations and that they intend to have a phase deal. And I think their view is that, I believe it's Article 24 provides some flexibility to do that. I don't know what more I can say than that. Is it an airtight argument? Well, someone in Geneva can decide, but that's the argument they're making. And I would just say, look, the substantially all trade has never been thoroughly litigated. I can tell you, while I was at USTR, we were somewhat skeptical of whether a lot of European agreements met that threshold. So I think if people actually want to go down that rabbit hole, it could be pretty interesting.
Stacy?
Yeah, I agree with Clete on this. I agree that the, ag market access issues, I think we're negotiating those was particularly helpful. In the Biden administration, I don't see an incentive to push Japan on this issue. And, with respect to the substantially all trade standard, again, it hasn't really been tested. The idea was it's, it's at least a 10-year period for negotiations. And, again, to Clete's point, who's going to be the first, member country to tee this up? Because, those that live in glass houses, right? So I just don't see the Biden administration making this a priority because I don't think Japan's really that interested at this point. And so, it gets thrown back to Geneva. And again, Japan can continue to make noises that they're willing or they're still in discussions with the United States. Maybe they do that to try and just sort of hold off other countries. But, I don't think anybody really wants to go down the path of trying to get into a formal discussion about what substantially all trade means. I don't think it works out well for anybody.
I'm looking at questions from the audience, and there's one for Clete, and it's why is reducing the trade deficit important from an economic standpoint?
Well, I may not be the best member of the former member of the Trump administration to answer this question. Look, we did argue internally about this issue. Some of us felt that it wasn't the best metric to measure success. And so, I'm not sure I really agree that it is the most efficient or important from an economic standpoint. I will say though, it was interesting. There was one time though, when the president was talking about it, that may surprise you all, but I'll tell the story because for me, it sort of struck a chord. And it was when he was talking to the Europeans about Russia. And he was talking about how Europe was running this huge deficit with Russia on natural gas, and basically how it was empowering Putin to do all the trouble that he was causing around the world. And it really, to me, I could then see how he might think about it, is that when you run a deficit with someone, you're transferring wealth to them. That wealth then can be used for them to achieve goals, some of which may be military, or to have them have leverage over you. And that's how he viewed it with Russia and the relationship that they had with the European Union on natural gas. And that I would say was one time when I said, oh, wow, I really do get why you focus on this issue. But again, from a broad standpoint, I'm not the one to make that argument. I was simply just noting that those who believe that is a really important issue have made the point internally that we really, if we're going to fix it, we need to fix currency. And that is the way that they've wanted to try to do it.
Okay, another question is, what monetary policy options would the Trump administration consider, given that the comparative strength of the dollar is relatively set due to its status as the global reserve currency?
Yeah, and I can jump in on this one. I think they'd like to renegotiate that, or at least some members of the administration would. And again, I want to be careful here. This isn't a uniform view. But I think if you talk to certain folks in the administration, they would say, we had the Plaza Accord. Should we take another look at that? I think if you talk to other administrations, other officials in the administration, they'd say definitely not. I don't want to go down that path. But that would be an option that one could look at. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that they're going to do that. I'm simply suggesting that some of the folks who raise these issues have considered those kinds of options as policy possibilities.
Stacy, did you want to comment at all on this? Okay. If anyone else has a question, they should, put into the Q&As like right now. There's a question that's on Buy America, and points out that Trump issued several executive orders, and it's a big issue of Biden's Build Back Better plan. And the question is, how would you characterize the atmosphere and or appetite for negotiating changes to the WTO government procurement agreement? And then the second part is the OECD a viable alternative forum for procurement policy coordination? Do either of you want to comment, or do you want me to jump in?
You're the expert on this.
You're the expert, Gene. You do it.
I think in terms of in his one of his recent executive orders, the president, Biden's plan suggested there could be some revision of some provisions of the GPA. I mean, I think the parties to the GPA might be open to revisions, but I'm not sure that they're going to be the kind of revisions that would either address concerns of a Trump administration might be looking at, or a Biden administration. I think in the executive order the president put out, he suggested that there could be some changes, discussed, and it's just not clear what those could be. In terms of using the OECD as a forum, back before when the first agreement was negotiated, the OECD was the first forum before it went into the multilateral trade negotiations. And I question, I guess, whether there would be a basis for taking it to the OECD. Most of those countries are parties to the GPA, and the broader problem is that you don't have a big appetite for procurement disciplines among more than the GPA parties, which are like less than 1/3 of the GPA membership, of the WTO membership. So I don't see sort of revising the GPA as probably something that's going to really satisfy the U.S. I mean, the U.S. would like, I think, a negotiation that said, okay, Buy America preferential policies are fine, but that's probably would undercut the GPA.
Yeah, obviously I agree with the expert on this. Let me just add a couple of things. I mean, first, I do think the Trump administration has been thinking about this for the reason that Gene mentioned. But I am also skeptical that other members will want to do it. The one thing I'll say about the GPA now, I mean, there have been rumors out there as well, maybe we're looking at withdrawal, things like that. To me, that would be a huge mistake from a substantive standpoint, but also if you actually look at the GPA itself, it is a non-MFN plurilateral agreement. And what that means is there are no free riders. You only benefit from it if you're a member of it. And I actually think that might be a model. I know people in Geneva really get nervous about this, the Europeans in particular. Oh my gosh, let's not do MFN anymore. But I think if we're realistic, are we really going to get an MFN agreement on, some of the most important issues facing us today? I just don't think the ambition's there for much of the world. And so I think we need to look at the non-MFN model for plurilaterals. And in my opinion, it's better to have it at least under the auspices of the WTO, where others could eventually join in as part of the WTO, than to have us just go do it solo, without any consideration of WTO. But I think that the GPA is the unique model for that. And I think that we're going to want to look at that in other areas. Gene, I did also just note, and I'll just answer this question in 12 seconds. Someone asked about the swing state polling and voter registration data. I mentioned in my opening remarks. So the Real Clear Politics does a great job of doing the swing state polling, and they're doing comparisons between this year and in 2016. And I would encourage you to take a look at that to see what I'm talking about. And then the voter registration stuff, I don't know the source of it, but I saw it from the Cohen group, circulated some documents on that this week. And it really is eye-popping that if you look at some of the key swing states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, where I'm from, your Republican new registrations is off the charts right next to the Democrats. So, who has the enthusiasm advantage? I don't know. Is Trump going to win? I don't know. I think he's behind, but I think it's going to be close. And, we'll see. We'll see whether I'm any more accurate this time than I was last time I talked to you guys.
Any closing remarks, Stacy?
No, thanks. And thanks very much for moderating, Jean. And thanks to Poppy and the WCL team for pulling this together. And it was great to appear and talk with my dear friend, my old friend, Clete.
I also want to say thank you to Jean, a former colleague who I learned a lot from at USTR, and Stacy, a former professor who I learned a lot from at my days at Georgetown. So it's really great to be with both of you and to be with everyone at American as well.
Yep. Thanks to you all. Thanks for all of you for coming. Okay. Thank you. Bye.